you doing, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of So What, where I'm going to tell you how to do the waistband, where to add the snaps on the waistband, and then how to finish the hemline of the skirt. For this, you're going to want 1/2 inch double folded bias tape close to the color of the skirt that you're trying to add a waistband to. So if you have worked with bias tape before, you'll notice that one fold is a little bit longer than the other. You will want to sew on the side with the shorter fold because as you go along, you're going to be more likely to catch the other side that is longer. Be sure to leave a little bit extra here. We can cut the extra off later. So basically, we're just going to come back and finish the center front later. So what the bias tape is going to do is we're going to sort of sandwich the pleats in between the tape. Some of you may be asking why I use bias tape. Well, frankly, I feel like it adds a lot of stabilization to the waistband. If you're going to add the snaps directly to the skirt, you run the risk of eventually tearing apart the skirt, as the stress for the snaps can eventually wear out onto the satin. We will start off by stitching on the bottom edge of the bias tape. Once we have finished that, we're going to stitch around the top and then twice more in the middle. You'll see this step later on. So what are we going to do with this extra bias tape in the front? We're going to do something called miter the corners. So to find the correct angle, what I'll do is I'll use my Pilot friction pen that disappears with heat and mark the inside of the bias tape. Once you have your lines marked on either half of the bias tape, you'll go ahead and sew it on the sewing machine. I prefer to do this step at a 2mm stitch. Once you have sewn it, go ahead and trim the inside corner. Once that is settled out, I just use my fingers to get the seam allowance to lay flat. And you'll notice you have a few tiny little corners hanging off too because, yay, geometry, so feel free to cut those off. Once you have mitered your corner and sew down the bottom of that, go ahead and stitch on the top edge of the bias tape. Once I have stitched the top edge, I'm going to go ahead and fill in the middle part with 2 extra rows of stitches. But once you add the snaps are going to start putting a lot of stress in that area. So to prevent that from happening, we're just going to reinforce it with these extra rows of stitches. Once you have done this part, you're ready for snaps. This part is pretty easy. It's just a little bit time consuming because it's a lot of hand sewing. Me personally, I use 7 snaps on this part, 2 in the front, 1 on each side, and 3 in the back. I use 3 in the back because that's where the bow is going to sit. I put my bows directly onto the hip roll, and the hip roll is sewn to the skirt. So having extra strength in the back is really important to be able to support the weight of that. Once you have finished sewing all 7 of the snaps into place, and everything fits well with your leotard, you're ready to move on to the hem. You'll want the pleats to look like a step case, and the face of the pleat should always be the longest. You shouldn't really see any visible part of the back side of the pleat. You may notice in a lot of cases that the front of your skirt hangs a little bit lower than the rest. So I usually try to remedy this by trimming the hem. If you don't skip this step, it'll really make your skirt look really polished in the end. Once you have carefully and painstakingly trimmed the hem to a point that you really like it, this is where things might differ a little bit. Every person has a different method of hemming the skirt. For me personally, I like to use my serger. which is the Brother 1034D. Highly recommend this serger if you don't have one already or are looking for a new one. I've had this one for 5 years and it's still going strong. It is also capable of doing something called the narrow rolled hem. I like to set it up to get it a little bit dense, but not so thick that it starts to look like piping. The reason I want my stitches to be a little bit close when I do the narrow roll hem is so that way the fabric doesn't fray, but also it will help in the next step where I feed it through a piping foot. Some other methods of hemming could include hemming it by hand, such as doing a slip stitch. If you're going to do a slip stitch, I would recommend leaving 5/8 inches for a hem. Because remember, the more times you fold it over, the more fabric that you're going to end up losing. So if you're doing the serging method, you'll go ahead and go all the way around. Be careful when you get back to the spot that you started. You'll want to try and trail off as evenly as you can without leaving any weird point or too much excess overlap. We're going to top stitch it at a size 3 stitch. So now comes the long, tedious process of hemming the skirt. Once you finish off at the end, be sure to press the hem. No matter what hem method you're doing, press your hem. All you have left to do now is the hip roll. Thank you so much for watching. I know it can be a little bit confusing, so if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment. If you want to see more videos like this, don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you next time on So What?